Check, check. See, sig. It's sig. Change. Hearing me. Skip.
80 minutes. Didn't Dr. Bridget book
I don't. Jillian, do you have a clicker for the laptop?
I can't have one.
You know what? I'm fine. That mouse might be wireless.
No, I can get it. I have one. Which not always works, but like 80% of the time.
Don't worry, don't touch it. No, don't touch it.
Oh, I won't.
I can go first.
Yeah, have it broken, don't come.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch break and you're no longer in food coma. I'm a little bit, so if I doze off, please poke me and wake me up. Before I start introducing the panel to most of my classes here, I know we're starting class at 2:30, but the panel won't be out until 2:30, so it's okay. You stay until 2:30, we'll walk over to the classroom. So don't panic. Welcome to our third panel of the day. This time we're going to talk about trade and the political economy. And most of you who have already been here in the morning already know two of our panelists, but I will reintroduce all of them in case you missed this morning's panels. So first up, we have Dr. Tobias Hoffmann from the University of Utah. He works on the political economy of international institutions with a focus on multilateral and preferential trade agreements as well as the European integration. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Utah, and before joining the University of Utah, he held position at the National University of Singapore, the College of William and Mary, the Idaho Center for Globalization and Governments at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, there must be an abbreviation for that, and the Harvard University Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He is a graduate of the University of Constance and received his PhD from the Free University of Berlin. Following Tobias is Dr. Xin Ru. He's an assistant professor here at Idaho State University in the Political Science Department. His research interests include politics and sustainable development goals, strengthening public sector capacity building in developing country context, and infrastructure development implementation frameworks. He's the principal, or was the principal, researcher for WatersAid's comparative sanitation case studies of Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea, has worked extensively as a researcher for the World Bank, and has given many, many talks, including at the Asian Development Bank, the Korean Environmental Institute, and the Sanghyungbwan University Water Institute. He has his PhD from George Mason University and Master of Science from Queen Mary University in London, and his BA and MA from the Washington University in St. Louis. And finally, Dr. King Yik. He is an assistant professor here at Idaho State University at the Global Studies Department. He received his MBA and PhD from the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago, specializing in international business. His current research interests include the role of international organizations in economic development. As you noticed in the program, we had one panelist canceled due to health issues at the last second, so Jonathan Strand couldn't be with us today, and King Yik, as the previous panels, agreed within like 24-hour notice to step up and provide a presentation for this panel. So thank you again for stepping up and not letting us hang in the balance. So welcome everyone, and we're looking forward to your presentations.
Good have to stand behind the podium, or can I walk around?
You can walk around.
Can walk around?
Oh,
Great.
actually, we are recording, so you have to have a mic. You can have the microphone in your hand if that works.
Okay, we'll see. Just kind of doing something about that food coma that you mentioned earlier. And if you decide to fall asleep, I'm not going to hold it against you. Last semester, I taught in the University of Utah's movie theater hall. Right after lunch, the room being kind of dimmed, popcorn is sold in the back, and yeah, lots of students fell asleep, and it's okay, I understand. Following this morning's, before I start, I want to, of course, thank the organizers for inviting me and putting together this great symposium. Political economy and trade. Before kind of seeing this morning's presentations, I thought I'll just kind of talk a little bit about the shit show that is Brexit and issues related to this, but then I saw that most of the other presentations were kind of more related to the people's own research and a little bit more academic, so I decided kind of last minute to switch and focus more on dispute settlement, which is kind of my area of expertise within international organizations related to trade, and specifically the World Trade Organization, as well as regional integration agreements such as the European Union, or it was already mentioned earlier this morning, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think all of those are or have become more prominent or seem to gain more kind of public interest, I guess, over the last couple of months, thanks to I'm a non-resident alien, a visa holder, but thanks to you all voting in the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump. So, quickly, kind of, what am I, okay, I prefer to.
Is it possible for him to have a walking microphone?
I'll take this, or do you have one without
There's a wireless.
Fantastic. Somehow I need to be a little bit more energetic here at this time of the day. Great. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about, how are trade disputes settled in different organizations, why, how, and does it matter? Okay, now I have two things in my hand. And as I mentioned, kind of it fits into my general research, which focuses on dispute settlement in international organizations, and really all the way kind of from the design of these institutions. So why is it that the World Trade Organization's way of settling trade disputes kind of looks different? It's differently organized from that of NAFTA, the European Union, and so on, all the way to the question of, well, does it actually matter? Does it make a difference? So once, for instance, in the World Trade Organization, a dispute over bananas and the European Union, or beef, or hormone-treated beef and the European Union, or softwood lumber between Canada and the US, once these disputes are settled, does it actually make any difference on the ground? Do we, for instance, see more trade happening after dispute settlement than before? Specifically, first, I want to focus on the World Trade Organization, and I assume that many of you have heard about it and already know a lot about it, but just in case, I have a few slides that kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what this organization is about before taking a closer look at the dispute settlement mechanism. World Trade Organization, well, and then, as I said, move on to these regional trade agreements. And kind of the first step is, I guess, what are they all about? Well, all of them are, generally speaking, about liberalizing trade, removing barriers to trade. Traditionally, kind of in the past, this was primarily tariffs, so taxes on the import of goods. But these days, there's a lot of other things. There are quantitative restrictions, so-called quotas. So for instance, I can't remember the exact number, but I think per year, about 3,890,527 gloves and mittens from the Philippines may enter the United States. Not a single one more. So if you arrive with your boat filled with mittens, and unfortunately already that many mittens have entered the United States, you have to wait until the 1st of January of the next year. So negotiations for that, trying to get rid of these restrictions, or at least reducing them or increasing the quotas. But even more kind of newer issues that these organizations address in the context of liberalization of trade is, for instance, national standards, environmental standards, things that don't necessarily affect the product itself, but its production. Or for instance, American cars for some reason need a third headlight. European cars don't. So if you are a European or a Japanese car manufacturer, well, you have to go through all sorts of American testing and regulation processes and install these third brake lights and so on. Sorry, did I say headlights?
Yes.
Brake lights. Sorry about that. And so on. All of these kind of things obviously making international trade more complicated, and the quest or the idea for these organizations to try to, well, reduce these barriers, these artificial, kind of non-natural barriers to trade. Natural barriers being more kind of distance. Simply, shipping something across long distances is expensive, and therefore we don't see as much trade between, let's say, South Africa and Norway than between Norway, Sweden, or Canada and the US. Now, in terms of these different organizations that I would want to address, have slightly different approaches to addressing this issue or trying to overcome it. On the one hand, we have the World Trade Organization. It's a so-called multilateral organization, which essentially means that simply everyone is part of it. But of course, that creates some problems. Yeah? I don't know, to my students, I always say when they have to do a team presentation maybe, well, if that team consists of 2 students, it's fairly easy to find a date that you can kind of work together. But if you have a team of 15, 14 out of these 15s are probably going to shirk their work. Yeah? The same thing, of course, in international organizations. If you have a multilateral organization, if you find a solution, if you solve the problem of international trade at the global level for everyone, that's great, but actually getting there can be very difficult. So on the other hand, we have these regional organizations, and we have had a dramatic increase in these post the end of the Cold War, so since the 1990s, which are more like coalitions of the willing. Small group of countries that can agree on a specific set of rules, 2, 3, NAFTA currently 3, but the predecessor to CAFTA, so the Canada-US agreement, only 2. European Union, currently 28, soon to be 27 probably, or not. We'll see what happens with the United Kingdom. Or, for instance, the TPP that was mentioned earlier and that the US is now no longer part of, would have been 12 countries. And they vary in their in the degree of depth. Something like, for instance, TPP would have just been a preferential trade agreement. So there's a little bit of trade liberalization here and there, but not across the board. We have something like a free trade agreement like NAFTA, which at least ideally liberalizes trade across the board. So it's not just a reduction of kind of the tariff on potatoes by 5% and that on t-shirts for 15, but really across the board. And then we have something, well, the European Union is that, and more is really where you get rid of all customs or borders or barriers to trade between the countries, but you're also establishing a common external tariff. So as to avoid, for instance, issues that NAFTA faces all the time, so-called rules of origin. Kind of, well, Canadian goods can enter the United States for free, but what's a Canadian good? Well, is it enough that this car was kind of assembled in Canada, even though all the parts were first imported into Canada from Japan, Korea, and China? Or do at least, I don't know, 50% of the inputs into the car need to be Canadian made for it to count as Canadian? All of these issues can be avoided if you have a customs union, because simply whatever arrives anywhere in Vancouver or Seattle, in Montreal or New York, you pay the same kind of tariff, and then once it's inside that area, things can kind of travel for free. It's an issue in the context of NAFTA, but of course it will be most likely a very, very, very big issue in the context of Brexit. I wanted to talk about this earlier, it just comes now to my mind, is you've all heard about Brexit, the UK kind of pulling out of the European Union, and then as a consequence, at least if they crash out, there would be, well, reintroduction of a barrier between the UK and the European Union, and again, introduction of tariffs and so on. Now, a lot of kind of, I don't know, pro-Brexiteers had this idea, well, that once we are out, we can sign all these great free trade agreements that we somehow were not able to do as part of the European Union, because it makes no sense. It's obviously you can much more successfully negotiate something or get something from other countries if you're a market of 500 million rather than just 50. But anyway, even if they were to, for instance, let's say sign a free trade agreement with South Korea, and the European Union already has a free trade agreement with South Korea. Right now, if, let's say, all the components for a washing machine that's assembled in the United Kingdom come from South Korea, well, you have to pay it. You no longer, because of the free trade agreement between Korea and the European Union, these components can enter the UK for free, then they get assembled in the UK, and then that washing machine can be shipped to Portugal, Sweden, or so on, again, because it's the European Union, without any additional tax. Now, even if post-Brexit, you have a free trade agreement between the UK and Korea, and between the European Union and Korea, those pieces, those inputs that come from Korea and are shipped to the UK mean that whatever then crosses the border between the UK and Europe, the European Union, no longer meets the rule of origin requirements for that good to be a UK good, and therefore it's taxed, even though everyone involved has a free trade agreement. So UK, because of these rules of origin that I mentioned, that kind of an issue with free trade agreements, just like NAFTA, will be, can I say this? This is a very conservative town, very Mormon town, can I say?
Yeah.
Fucked. Okay, let's skip this. So, World Trade Organization, well, has been around for a long, long time, since the end of the Second World War, essentially in the form of the so-called GATT. But the organization itself, as it stands today, with its 164 members, goes back to 1995, when, as part of the so-called Uruguay round, well, the GATT, a simple kind of international treaty, was turned into an organization with employees, with a building in Geneva, and so on. And the main idea behind it is, well, that it helps with negotiating liberalization. For instance, due to you only having to negotiate with your principal suppliers or with your major trading partners, and then whatever you agree with them applies to everyone else. And these days, well, we are currently in the context of the so-called Doha, this doesn't work, the so-called Doha round negotiations that have been ongoing since 2002. If you kind of look at those states, you see that those rounds, those negotiations have become longer and longer. Some people claim that that's a sign of the kind of lack of success of the World Trade Organization, or that it's going to fall apart, when in fact exactly opposite is the case. Why are these negotiation rounds so complicated these days? Well, because all the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. All the previous negotiations have already reduced traditional trade barriers dramatically, so only the difficult things are left, like intellectual property, services, agriculture. Well, Idaho potato farmers probably would have issues if the U.S. market would be open to Irish potato farmers. I don't know what the major competitor is. Texas, well, there is free trade between Texas and Idaho. Even though, I mean, I have to say, as a European, I'm sometimes surprised how restricted interstate trade in the US is. So for instance, well, if I buy a bottle of booze here, I cannot take it back to Utah, supposedly. It's like, what? If I buy something in France, I can easily take it over to Germany or to Belgium without any restrictions. How much time do I actually have?
50 minutes.
15
Yes.
left, or overall?
Overall.
Oh, then I'm already out of time.
It's fine.
It's
fine.
Okay, so let me just quickly then ignore a few things and say, well, okay. The dispute settlement process is definitely currently in the news again, not just the World Trade Organization overall, but because of, well, the Trump administration kind of saying that, well, if we don't like whatever kind of outcome this dispute settlement mechanism produces, we might not stick with it. And kind of one of the suggestions is to go back to the pre-1995 GATT agreement, where essentially, think about it, it's kind of like going to court, or you got caught for stealing something, and then you go to the court and say, you know what, let's forget about this. So that's kind of how it worked prior to the World Trade Organization, where essentially whoever is accused of doing bad things in international trade would simply say, let's forget about this, let's not actually adjudicate this. Currently, under the World Trade Organization rules, if you're the bad guy, you have no chance. You get dragged to kind of the World Trade Organization's panel, so to its court, and you have to go through the process, and you might be found guilty. And now is the reason why should you comply? Why should you, even though the World Trade Organization doesn't have an army, can't force you to do anything? Well, because if the US does not follow the rules, what kind of example does it set? Yeah? Why would China suddenly play by the rules? And so far, again, the World Trade Organization has actually done a surprisingly good job. Yes, of course the US is often kind of at the receiving end of these cases. Why? Because it's one of the major trading nations. If Costa Rica doesn't play by the rule, no one cares, because the 5 T-shirts that Costa Rica produces or prevents you from importing, that no one is hurt by that. But U.S. market, attractive for foreign firms from around the world, obviously a major kind of target for these cases. But yeah, the U.S. traditionally, and probably should, follow these rules because it wants other countries to do exactly the same. And one of the major kind of formal rules of the World Trade Organization, but also generally speaking in international relations, economic relations, reciprocity. If you treat me nice, I treat you nice. If the US starts to treat other countries not so nice, well, that will be bad for US businesses. Even though there's all this talk about new kind of blue-collar manufacturing jobs, they are not coming back. Even if kind of the work came back, it would now be done by machines. It's all automated. So what is the US really kind of what should we be worried about is service sector. There's no other country in the world that has such a competitive service sector as the United States, from financial services, everything. And if the current US administration was to not play nice with the others, that's kind of where they would start to kind of tighten the screws and make life for the US economy, broadly speaking, very tough. Let's hope it's not going to have to come to that. And I'll just stop here and hand the mic over to the next presenter.
Hello once again, everyone. Dr. Oak, thank you for once again the great introduction. Dr. Hoffman, thank you for your coverage on the World Trade Organization, which is a very fascinating organization, especially in light of all the bilateral trade agreements that's actually going on. So today, I'm presenting on U.S. and the Sustainable Development Goals, but to be honest, this really doesn't fall under trade or treaties, but it's more of a consensus. Okay, so please keep that in mind as you're trying to conceptualize the presentation. So I'm excited once again to share with the audience today on our approach that is endorsed and embraced by the international community. It is a product of rethinking development that has focused way too much on economic surplus generation. We live in a paradoxical world. We enter an era of previously unwitnessed material wealth. However, it coexists in a period where populations do not have equal access to healthcare, where education access is limited, where people do not have access to improved water and improved sanitation facilities, where people still go hungry, and where slums persist. The narrow focus on economic development have often undervalued complementary features necessary for resilient and inclusive society. This does not mean that economic development orientation should be replaced, but it means that development should be approached comprehensively by including social inclusion and environmental stewardship. In this context arose...
It's the wrong way round.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Thank you. In this context arose the Sustainable Development Goals. So I guess the big question for those who first heard this term for the first time, what is exactly the Sustainable Development Goals? And we'll cover that. And so today my presentation will pretty much follow as follows. We'll talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how these goals are different from its predecessor, which is the Millennium Development Goals. And then the big question is, why does it matter? Once again, why does it matter? And does it even apply to the U.S. context? So we'll proceed and we'll get to kind of answer that big question at the end. Okay. So the Sustainable Development Goals is a set of 17 goals, and it basically starts from, if you can kind of go from the left to the bottom right, is we want a world where there's no more poverty. Okay? And we also want to eliminate hunger. We want to promote good health and wellness. We want to provide quality education. We want to promote gender equality. We want to ensure universal access to clean water and sanitation. We want to also promote affordable and clean energy. And we also want to promote decent work and economic growth. And we want to promote industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We want to reduce inequalities. We want to promote sustainable cities and communities. We want to promote responsible consumption and production. We want to promote climate action. We want to preserve life underwater. We want to preserve life on land. And we want to culture or nurture peace, justice, and strong institutions. And we want to further develop and deepen partnerships for the achievement of these goals. Now, as you're listening to it, this is kind of very ambitious. But what you should keep in mind is that why do these ambitious goals come to the fore? Because basically these goals come to the fore because there's still a lot of variation in our societies. And this is very, having moved from Virginia to Pocatello, you can clearly see this as well too. So, even within the U.S., there's huge disparities. Fairfax area, it's one thing that we notice is that, so I had kids, and we're trying to put our kids into kindergarten, but here I realized kindergarten is only offered half a week, half a day. Yes, half a day. So we were shocked. Because in Virginia, it's basically, in addition to that, you also have other services as well too. There's also that's one example of the large disparity within the U.S. as well too. And you can see this disparity also within town as well too. So the big question is, how do we address these issues, right? And you start to address it when you start to acknowledge them, right? And basically the simple notion of, you can't fix what you don't know. Right? And this platform, this approach, offers that framework to start asking questions and start, designing action and interventions, right? So, social scientist approach. Now, in order to understand sustainable development goals, we should also cover briefly the Millennium Development Goals. This is the predecessor that ended in 2015. Now, the Millennium Development Goals is 8 set of goals. It's eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and also promote global partnership for development. Now, when you look at these 2 different goals, one of the key things that you should strike is that, first of all, SDGs goals are broader. And there's a specific purpose for this. Because the first set of the Millennium Development Goals, just to give you a little more, before going into Millennium Development Goals, if you look at the history of the Millennium Development Goals, it's really promoted by this social scientist at Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs, who kind of promotes that if you start eradicating or kind of making improvements on these multiple fronts, then you're going to help the country move out of poverty or improve the well-being of its citizens. Now, as that kind of approach explains, the Millennium Development Goals was really focused on developing countries. Countries that were falling behind. That was the purpose of the Millennium Development Goals. However, when you go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals also applies to advanced industrialized nations. So this means also the United States. This means also Canada. This means also EU countries. Because in these countries, advanced industrial nations, these inequalities still persist, right? I mean, clearly the top 1% of the US, is not necessarily equal, as you can see, which is clearly known when you notice that the median income, household income, is very different from the average household income, right? Because the median household income is actually a lot lower than the average household income. That's one explanation, one illustration. But you also see, especially in healthcare as well too, here in the States, right? So you see clear disparity in terms of people who have access and people who don't. Education is also a big issue as well too. Also in terms of economic opportunity is also very broad as well too. So one of the reasons why Sustainable Development Goal is such an important aspect is because it applies to kind of the global economy. So basically all countries that's involved in the world. And it's actually pretty difficult and tall order to meet. So but it's aimed so that these goals, there will be work initiated to achieve these goals. Okay? Now the big question you might be asking is, does this matter to Idaho? Does it apply to the US? Yes. 3 exclamation marks. Yes. And more specifically applies to Southeast Idaho. So I taught a course, International Sustainable Development course last semester. And I asked the students to put together PADs, which is kind of the World Bank format for project appraisal document. On kind of, if they had to take action on sustainable development goals in Pocatello, what would they be? What kind of projects would you come up with? And so today I'm going to actually share some of the exciting projects that the students actually came up with. The first is sustainable development project is bike trails. So Pocatello once again is I guess falling behind in terms of bike trails, so that people, even though they want to go short distances, will get in a car, burn gas, emit CO2, and then even for something that is a couple blocks away, right? Because it's so ingrained here, right? So so this is one example of if you had to think about why were people using it, right? Why isn't this replanned, right? And why isn't this executed? So we were kind of so the project kind of entails the students to think creative, go out and collect data, meet people, and offer solutions. Now, what's really interesting is that I also asked them to if you had to compare your project with Sustainable Development Goals, what goals would it achieve? And so in this is Ashley's project, and I actually noted that it would hit all these areas in terms of Sustainable Development Goals, that it would promote these areas. Another project that one of my students is promoted is glass recycling. So if you know in Pocatello, there's no glass recycling.
Yep.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I asked the student to kind of think about glass recycling. How would you put together a project, and how much would it cost, and etc. So which is kind of very basic aspects of a project appraisal document. So this is Clint's project, and so basically he kind of identified sites. He also called vendors in terms of machinery, how much it would cost, and how that cost would be spread across, etc. And then basically it hits all these areas as well too, because if glass doesn't get recycled, where does it go? Landfill, exactly. So these are issues as well too. So the big question was why. There are other examples such as composting. So here there's not mandatory composting in Pocatello, so it's voluntary. So this was another kind of sustainable development project. So why isn't Pocatello being involved in composting? Boise does it. So this is Sarah's project because she compared kind of composting practices in Boise and kind of see its applications to Pocatello. And we have another project, Janae's project, who sits in the front here, about hunger. The big question is, does hunger persist in Pocatello? And the clear answer is yes. Right? So, despite there's food banks, there's various organizations, there are people who fall through the cracks. And this is really interesting because Idaho, Bannock County in Idaho actually has a pretty high poverty rate. And so when we're discussing this project, we're talking about the coverage of people that the coverage that the food bank actually did, and actually the number of people who fall into poverty, and the numbers didn't match. So this was kind of the brainchild of her, and one of the key things is that hunger is also associated with poor housing issues as well too. So people might get canned goods from food centers, but would not be able to cook them because they have no housing, right? So kind of these are kind of the things that we kind of were forced to think of. So going back to kind of sustainable development goals, why is it useful and why should we think about this? Well, it's useful because it illuminates the shortcomings that we can act upon. I think it's a very good framework to kind of nudge us to address these questions. And second of all, it actually incorporates a certain value component. It includes a value component where society should be inclusive. Right? So, and you should address those people who are suffering from hunger, suffering from inequality, and try to address those as much as possible. It also promotes environmental stewardship, right? Sometimes stewardship. So basically, just like recycling and composting, it's like, if you can recycle and leave small footprints, leave a more cleaner environment for our future children, then we should be able to do so. So these are kind of the reasons why, once again, going to kind of rethinking development, because we have focused so much on economic development, and that was the pure focus, and discounted everything else. So hopefully this will also be stimulating and encourage you to act as well. Thank you.
Sorry, that is not what you're getting.
We want that.
Let's go back to the
I know what he wants. Okay. Which one do we get? Down to go forward. Down.
Yeah, down will get to the next slide. Yeah. I think you're holding the remote.
Okay. I'm used to lecturing in a big lecture hall, the planetarium that you guys are going to go to for the keynote speech. So I'm not going to use a mic, and I think everybody, can people at the back hear me? Oh, go ahead.
I think it's for the recording that you need to.
Oh, for the recording.
Yes, but you can have the slide mic.
And I'm more used to having a screen in front of me when I talk. So, all right, some getting used to. I'm Kim Yik of Global Studies and Global Studies and Languages Department. Today, I'm going to talk about contrasting U.S. and China trade policy. Contrast U.S. and China. For the China part, I am going to look forward. What does China intend to do in the future? For the US part, I'm going to look back. What lessons can we learn from trade policies in the past? So this is the contrast. Start with China, China's trade policy. President Xi Jinping, President of China, in 2013, September, October, while on a trip visiting some Asian countries, announced this big thing, big initiative. And what is it? The original Silk Road connects China to Rome. Rome gets silk from China, and China gets spaghetti from Rome, or depending on who you ask, Italy actually got noodles, okay, from China. It's the other way around. Anyway, that's the past. So let's talk about today. President Xi wants to build the Silk Road for the 21st century. The Silk Road for the 21st century. This is the old one. According to my research, this is the name Silk Road was coined by a German map maker. I don't read German. There's some German word there. Does it really say a Silk Road?
It does, yeah.
It does. Wow.
D-sided transit.
Yeah. This might be the original copy. I don't know. President Xi wants to build the 21st century Silk Road. And this is a map of the plan. The plan actually has two parts. One part sort of mimics the old Silk Road. The blue part that goes from China through Central Asia to the Middle East and then eventually to Europe. That is the land part of the new Silk Road. The 21st century Silk Road has another part, not on land, but by sea. The sort of pink, orange one that goes down to the Indian Ocean and then up the coast of Africa towards Europe. So it has two parts. The blue part that is on land is called the belt. Okay, the belt. And for whatever reason, for reason I don't understand, the part that goes on sea is called the road. So the name for this big project is called One Belt, One Road. One belt, one road. So don't be confused. The belt is actually on land. Okay? The road is actually over the ocean. The short name for it is OBOR. For those of you familiar with some international finance, you might have heard of the London Interbank Offer Rate. The short name for it is LIBOR. The short name for one belt, one road is OBOR. And it's not just a dream. The president of China actually had an action plan. And in 2011, he released the action plan, and the English version of that action plan referred to it as the Belt Road Initiative, BMI. Okay, it's not your body mass, but BMI, a belt, a road, and initiative. This is a mega infrastructure project. It costs, to build it, is estimated to be, let me get the number right, 8 trillion, we're not talking about billion, 8 trillion US dollars till 2020. That means up to that point, so much will be needed, and more may be needed after 2020. It includes over 40 countries. So big thing, big infrastructure project. There are certainly economic reasons for building the new Silk Road. China's annual trade with countries along the road could grow to US $12.5 trillion. So there will be economic benefit to building the new Silk Road. A more dramatic illustration of why is important, has an economic benefit. If you ship a container from China to Rotterdam of the Netherlands, by sea it will take 60 days. once the Silk Road is complete, by train and by car, it will take 14 days. It will cut a lot of the transportation time. Even though China is selling this initiative as an economic project, not foreign policy, overall will certainly increase China's geopolitical power along the route. So it is not just trade, but also politics. Let me give you an example. The example is the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railroad. The short name for it, is SGR, Standard Gauge Railroad, in Kenya. It opened in the middle of last year. It links the inland capital, Nairobi, in Kenya, to the port city of Mombasa. So it's important, for the natural resources in the middle of Kenya to be able to reach the port easily. It costs $3.2 billion to build, and 90% of it is financed by a loan from the China Export-Import Bank. This is a map of Eastern Africa. In the lower right, you see Kenya, and you see Nairobi in the middle, and Mombasa at the coast. This part has already been completed in the middle of last year. There are plans to connect Nairobi to other parts of Eastern Africa, Uganda, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Burundi. So there are plans to expand and bring the resources in the middle part of Africa to the coast to be exported. This accomplishment was celebrated in a skit in the Chinese New Year Gala. You might know about a week ago, on Friday, was the Chinese New Year. So there was a big Chinese New Year Gala in China, and it's televised to 800 million people around the world. Lots of people watch that program. There are right now estimated 100,000 African students in China. China wants to build all this infrastructure in Africa, wants to establish friendly relationship with these African countries, so they have cultural exchange programs. So lots of students from Africa study in China, and also the many universities in China, they have study programs dedicated to Africa. The skit's African theme was chosen to please the Chinese leaders. They have this big initiative, and now, an important part of it in Africa has been completed, so let's celebrate it. The skit was also intended to highlight the close relationship between Africa and China. So let me go to the video that you saw the clip of. I'm sort of disappointed. I thought you'd like to hear me talk. I'm not getting this out. Now, so these are African students performing their traditional dance, and everybody, okay, was happy, okay, friendly, happy, getting along. And then, okay, later on there will be a Chinese host. Remember, this is in China. A Chinese host coming out and dancing along, okay, with the African dancers. And
That's all else like that.
I want to show you.
I know he's gonna defend it.
I want to show you, okay, the Chinese leaders enjoying this event. This is in the middle of the skit. You will see the mother of that young girl coming to talk to the host. The mother is actually a Chinese actress playing, okay, African woman. And, okay, blackface. And very exaggerated backside, carrying, okay, a basket of fruit. And what follows her is supposed to be a African maid. African's maid. So, as you can imagine, the students, African students in China, when they saw this, they were offended. And that, okay, led to other concerns about this big initiative by China. Is China going to be another colonial power coming to Africa to take our resources and exploit us? So it drew a lot of criticism. So the new Silk Road might be very bumpy, but the point I want to make in contrast to the US is China will continue to look outward towards South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. A list of 4 regions. But the point is, what is not on this list?
Western Hemisphere.
That's right, US.
Yep.
Western Hemisphere.
So that is the China part. Let me switch to the US part, US trade policy. The advantage of not knowing until 24 hours ago that I'm going to talk, that means I can use very fresh material. President Trump yesterday, submitted to Congress his 2018 trade policy agenda. What is his agenda here on US trade policy? Here are the highlights from yesterday's report. Supporting our national security. Trade is tied to national security. Strengthening the US economy, negotiating better trade deals, aggressive enforcement of US trade laws, reforming the multilateral trading system. These are not really new. From the campaign, we know this is his position. I want to focus on 3 aspects of the trade policy. The first aspect is actually included in the title of the trade policy agenda. It says, putting America first. That is number 1. The second aspect is the emphasis on bilateral trade negotiation. instead of multilateral trade negotiation. This is consistent with candidate Trump's acceptance speech when he accepted the nomination to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And this is from his speech. I pledge to never sign any trade agreement that hurts our workers or that diminishes our freedom and independence. Instead, I will make individual deals with individual countries, bilateral trade, instead of talking in a big group like the World Trade Organization, multilateral. And the third one is aggressive enforcement of US trade laws. 3 aspects. These are good policies. I have nothing against them, and I'm not going to say that, they have weaknesses. Turn it into another country, maybe Germany, China, Japan, they would probably do the same. So, but what I do want to say is, while these are good policies, they need to be complemented, supported by other policies, or complemented by other perspectives for these policies to be effective. If indeed that is the goal of President Trump, on top of these things, he will need to do some other things and maybe include some other perspective. What are the implications of America first? So America is number 1. There's no mention of other number 1s. We are the only number 1. So everybody is number 3 or below. In other words, our trading partners are our enemies. We want to win. Trade is not a win-win situation. There's a winner, we are the winner, and the other side has to be the loser. What are the implications of bilateral negotiation? In a bilateral negotiation, it is we against a very clearly defined opponent. There's only one. We against the other guy. Therefore, there might be a tendency to focus on exclusively, my English teacher would say more exclusively is not right, on this bilateral fight and forget what is happening outside of this particular fight. Take US-China trade as an example. US is imposing a punitive import tax on washing machine from China and also South Korea, if I'm not mistaken. The US is accusing these countries of unfair trade. Let's say China engage the US in this battle over washing machines. After 3 years, the US won the battle against China. And that is great for the US. We won. And during these 3 years, China's Belt and Road Initiative makes significant progress. China now trade more with the EU. In fact, China is already trading more with the European Union, Dr. Wu, am I correct? Than trading with the US. Central Asia, South Asia, and Africa. So if the US focus on winning this particular battle against China over washing machine, solar panel, and not pay attention, but the US wants to disengage. Other things are happening. And the US, you can anticipate, I chose the word battle deliberately. We won the battle, but we lost the war.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that this will happen. But because of the emphasis on women and on bilateral negotiation, there is the risk of losing sight of what's happening outside of this bilateral relationship. What's the implication of an aggressive enforcement of US trade law? US uses its trade law to help its companies. Nothing wrong with that. Japan does it, China does it, the UK does it. For example, the punitive import tax on washing machine will help Whirlpool in Ohio. Has there been any successful example of a US company emerging stronger after the help of an import tax? The answer is yes. There are successful examples. So maybe the US should use aggressive enforcement of US trade law. I didn't have enough time, to find, the audio. The Harley Davidson has a very distinctive sound when you start it. Okay, I wanted to look for it, but I didn't have enough
You
time.
have to repeat potato, 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 potato.
In 1983, President Reagan raised the import tax on motorcycle from Japan from 4.4% to 49.4% to help out Harley Davidson. The high import tax was scheduled to go down every year, and after 5 years, there will be a decision. Should the tariff be removed, going back to low 4.9%, or should it be extended? After 4 years, 1 year before the sunset of that protective tariff, Harley Davidson told the US government this: we are good now. We can compete against Honda, Kawasaki, and so on from Japan. We don't need the protection from the tariff anymore. We don't need it. This is 1 year ahead of schedule. It's a great success story. US tariff policy helped out a US company, and the company turned around and can compete against Japan. August of last year, Cato Institute, I gave you one example. Cato Institute did a survey of all instances of US tariff protection, all of them, from 1947 to today. Harley-Davidson success story was an exception. Most other tariff protections, but US companies that were protected, they did not improve. They continued to decline, and some went out of business. Another example of tariff protection is illuminated. In 1986, the US accused Japan of dumping memory chips in the US and hurting US makers. US imposed a punitive tariff on Japanese memory chip. Within 1 decade, all but one US makers of memory chip left the market. It's not that they moved their production plants to another country. They simply got out of that business. The US government considers semiconductor industry as a strategic key industry for the future, and repeatedly urged US makers like Intel, this is the future. We need you to continue to produce memory chips. We don't want to lose it to Japan. Intel politely declined for a good reason. Memory chip does not think. What is important in a computer is the part that can think. the central processing unit of the computer. Intel can patent the CPU. Intel, with the patent protection, will be the only one who can make that CPU. No competition, big money to be made. Memory chips, no patent. Any country with enough money can build a fabrication plant and make memory chip. So much competition, the profit margin is extremely thin. Intel said, I'm not going to tie up my good money in memory chip. I'm getting out and put my money in CPU. So, US has many great companies that can make good decisions without the help of the government. If Intel had listened to the government and continue to run those memory chip plants, they might not have enough money to develop the CPU. Back to the Harley-Davidson success story. The import tax on Japanese motorcycle certainly helped Harley. But more importantly, Harley did a lot to help itself. What did it do? Retool its factories, introduce a new engine, develop soft tail, hidden rear suspension system, more comfortable for your rear end, switch from a rigid mounted engine to rubber mounted, introduce just-in-time inventory management system, which they learned from Japan. An unfair trading partner certainly needs to be called out. Punitive tariff is certainly a useful tool to get the unfair partner to change. But too much emphasis on wielding the weapon might divert attention from what needs to be done internally in the US to rebuild the industry, to improve, so that US companies can come out of the protection stronger. What is Whirlpool going to do? Right now, it's being protected by a tariff. Is it going to do the Harley and improve and compete? Or is it going to use the protection to jack up prices? There's not enough washing machines from China and South Korea, so people will continue to buy the older Whirlpool models. Whirlpool has a choice. One will be good, the other not so good. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about this. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we have a little bit of time for questions, and I'm going to just use my right as a discussant to ask one which is really close to my heart. So are you telling me that my Samsung fridge that has the built-in sparkling water dispenser is going to be more expensive now?
Unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Well, that's bad news for us. So anyone has questions, please raise your hand. I have tons, but I want you to ask questions. Yes.
What about the possibility that tariffs will start a trade war?
I guess the question is directed to me.
Yeah.
If I'm thinking from China's perspective, following my script, if the US put a tariff on some of Chinese products, China is going to engage the US, get the US focused on the washing machine, on the solar panel, and then continue on with their courting of the 40 countries along the New Silk Road. The part that I skipped was, we in the US, we use yachts. We like football. Other countries, they use speeders. We in the US in the past, we use CDMA. If you don't know what it is, instead of GSM. Cell phone has two kinds of standards, CDMA and GSM. When you travel outside the US, your CDMA phone from old Verizon won't work outside the US. The rest of the world, they use GSM. However, we continue to use yak, we continue to use CDMA for a long time. Why? We are big. If they want to sell anything to us, they will just have to make what we want. The ship might have sailed.
I think so. Yeah.
China has a big middle class. They will have enough internal demand. They don't have to rely on exporting to the US as much.
That's right.
China is trading more with the European Union. So if we disengage and we say, well, we don't like it, we're not going to come back until you guys change.
That-
While the US is
that
away, the world has changed. And they won't be making products measured in yaks or cell phones on CDMA for us. I hope that partly answers your question. They might use a strategy of engaging the US on one thing and then continuing on with the grand plan.
So we have time for one more question.
Yep.
I noticed with the Silk Road and the Silk Belt that these are actually reminiscent of the old trading routes used by both Chinese maritime traders as well as the overland routes. And I guess that this sort of has two components. One, I can see reestablishing those routes because they made sense historically, prehistorically, as well as today. But in the past, these routes had been negotiated or facilitated by the central nomadic peoples, who are these ethnic groups, the tribal units that we were talking about with Pakistan and Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. All of those peoples were involved in developing these trade routes through the steppes area. And now today with these nation states that are extremely fragile, I think the comment this morning was weak states, strong societies. How is China negotiating with, are they negotiating with the states, or are they negotiating with these tribal and ethnic societies as they're trying to build a 21st century conveyance route across these ancient cultural landscapes?
My impression is that they're negotiating with the government of the states. It comes from the strong man identity of President Xi of China. You might have heard, either yesterday or the day before yesterday, the People's Congress of China just said that there's not going to be any term limit. In the past, it was a 10-year term limit, and from 1978 up until today, 10-year is the firm limit. Step down. But now the People's Congress of China said no more term limit, and he, as a strong man, can serve forever.
So he's gonna be there forever?
That's what it looks like.
So he, I guess he would expect the governments that he negotiates with will be strong and suppress any ethnic local opposition to this grand project, and use money to buy friendship.
The countries that you were talking about in terms of Central Asia, a lot of the countries are renter states. That means that they have their GDP is highly reliant on natural resources. And as you can see in typically these countries that they nationalize typically the natural resources, especially oil. So like Mongolia has I think the largest coal mine in the world has the top 5 copper mine in the world. So of course these are always held by the central government. Uzbekistan is also the same. A lot of Central Asian countries do have oil, but that's very tightly held by the central government because that's where they generate the revenues. So
unfortunately we have to stop here. The keynote speaker, Dr. Chantal de Jong-Utrecht, will be in the planetarium in Rendezvous at 5 p.m. today, so I hope to see you there. She's a fabulous lady and knows a lot of things, so it should be a really great talk on women and peace. The Frank Choice Symposium will resume after the keynote tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. with Tobias Hoffman's lecture, it has a fancy name, and a panel on global governance. So thank you for coming. We hope to see you at the keynote, and thank you to our panel. Gender, race,